violations are treated as administrative infractions and removed completely from the criminal realm. That means getting caught using or possessing drugs could result in a small fine or a referral to treatment where appropriate, but not jail time or a criminal record. The crisis in Portugal soon stabilized, and the ensuing years saw dramatic drops in problematic drug use, infection rates, overdose deaths, and drug-related crime. Portugal's mortality rate from drugs is now 4 times lower than the European average. The number of teenagers who have experimented with drugs has fallen, and the number of people in treatment has increased. 90% of public money spent fighting drugs is now channeled towards healthcare goals. Just 10% is spent on enforcement. In contrast, in Canada, 70% of funding spent combating drug use is spent on enforcement. We have the second highest rates of cannabis use among young people in the world, and an opioid overdose crisis that is staggering. 4,000 Canadians lost their lives to overdoses in 2017, up from 3,000 in 2016. We're on track in 2018 to exceed that death toll, with as many as 6,000 Canadians dying from overdoses. In British Columbia, overdose deaths spiked this March, marking the province's second highest monthly total in history. At the Liberal Party's recent policy convention, delegates voted overwhelmingly to back Jagmeet Singh and the NDP's position on decriminalization and medical regulation as a means of responding to drug overdose deaths. A coalition of 200 family, friends, organizations, policy experts, including former Liberal leader Bob Rae, impacted by the overdose crisis, wrote an open letter urging the Liberals to, quote, "Be the progressive government you promised to be, choosing human rights and evidence-based policy over ideological relics. We need you to listen to our voices as we call for the essential next step, decriminalization." The example of Portugal and other European countries illustrates that this policy works. We ask you to prevent thousands of more unnecessary deaths by supporting this resolution, end quote. However, both the Liberal Minister of Health and the Prime Minister responded by unequivocally ruling out action. The Liberal government has also refused to launch an investigation or initiate legal action to recover damages from opioid manufacturers for the tragic consequences and public costs of this crisis. Instead, Liberals have left victims to seek recourse through a private class action lawsuit. This resulted in a proposed settlement of $20 million, with a paltry $2 million allocated to provincial health authorities. Thankfully, this settlement was rejected because no steps were taken to ensure that past and potential future public health care costs were identified. This stands in contrast to aggressive action from U.S. government authorities, which has led to almost $700 million in damages and criminal convictions for improper marketing. What message does it send when thousands of Canadians die from overdoses and our government fails to seek justice? We owe it to the memory of those lost to this crisis to hold those who profited to account. We need significant federal money for addiction prevention, education, treatment, and harm reduction. And we need to stop treating the most vulnerable members of our society like criminals. Given the severity of the opioid crisis and that we expect more deaths this year, why won't the Liberal government even consider these evidence-based proposals?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Small Business and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, our government is deeply concerned about the opioid crisis. This is a national public health crisis that's affecting Canadians across regions and from all segments of society. Our government has taken significant actions to respond to the crisis. These actions complement the Government of Canada's overall approach to drug policy, which is collaborative, compassionate, comprehensive, and evidence-based. Our government has responded through supporting a public health response, enacting new legislation, fast-tracking regulatory action, and significant new investments. Budget 2018 proposed more than $231 million over 5 years and $13.5 million per year on an ongoing basis to support new cross-cutting initiatives to address the crisis. This commitment includes a one-time emergency funding of $150 million for provinces and territories to improve access to treatment services across Canada. Indeed, we have moved the bar tremendously in the face of the crisis. All the actions that we have taken, including enforcement actions, are to protect and improve the health of Canadians. For instance, we have taken action by making a greater variety of treatment options available to respond to the opioid crisis and other emergency situations. This includes the implementation of regulations to address urgent public health needs. We have also facilitated access to methadone and medical-grade heroin for the treatment of opioid use disorder. Our response to the opioid crisis also includes significant actions to reduce harms associated with problematic substance abuse. For example, by making naloxone available to Canadians without prescription. One of the most important ways that we can help reverse the trend of increasing opioid-related overdoses and deaths is by informing Canadians about the risks associated with the legal and illegal opioids. The reality is that the impact of this public health crisis has devastated individuals, families, and communities and continues to affect far too many Canadians. Canadians are demanding that we do more to turn the tide on this crisis and that we do more to hold the pharmaceutical industry accountable for its role in the opioid crisis. Our government is encouraging all organizations to take action and contribute to the response of the opioid crisis. This includes the pharmaceutical industry. I note with interest that Purdue US has voluntarily decided to not promote prescription products in the United States as their contribution to limiting the potential harms of opioid medications. I would like to see this type of action here from Canadian pharmaceutical companies as well. In the meantime, our government is pursuing strong actions to address industry advertising of prescription opioids to health professionals and organizations. We acknowledge that the pharmaceutical industry's advertising of opioids can provide health professionals with useful information, but it can also create bias and potentially influence prescribing practices. That is why, as part of the comprehensive federal response to the crisis, the Government of Canada is exploring federal options to increase transparency of industry's marketing of opioids. All appropriate options to hold the industry accountable for their continued role in this worsening crisis are being explored. We are committed to working in cooperation with provinces and territories, as well as health practitioners, toward greater transparency. Ultimately, together, we'll continue to bring forward solutions to save lives and address this national public health crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the reality is that this government, Liberals, refuse to declare a public health emergency, and while they're talking, the death toll goes up. Now, Mr. Speaker, the arguments for legalization of cannabis are precisely the reasons that underpin decriminalization and regulation of other drugs. It helps with harm reduction. It eliminates the criminal element. It provides safety of product. It protects children and vulnerable Canadians. It unclogs our criminal justice system to deal with real crime. And it treats addiction and substance use as a health issue, not a criminal or moral one. So my question to my honourable colleague is this. These arguments, the arguments for legalizing cannabis are probably not even as compelling as those for other drugs since they're more dangerous. So would she not agree with me that her government should at least look at decriminalizing and regulating all drugs like they have done for cannabis?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to addressing this unprecedented health crisis. We will leave no stone unturned in rooting out the causes of opioid crisis. We are monitoring, advertising, assessing evidence, and seeking views on restricting opioid advertising in Canada. We will continue to work with health professionals, experts in problematic substance abuse, stakeholders, provinces and territories, municipalities, and other partners to respond to this crisis. Our government remains committed to reducing harms related to problematic opioid use and addressing the epidemic of opioid-related overdoses in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Conformément à l'ordre adopté mardi 29,
the motion to adjourn the House is now deemed to have been adopted.
adjourned until tomorrow at 2 p.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.